Hey guys, tonight we begin an extraordinary journey through history's most humbling moments. Moments that prove even the most powerful rulers on earth weren't immune to life's most embarrassing endings. You've conquered nations, commanded armies of thousands, built magnificent castles, and then you die on a toilet. I'm talking about kings and queens who ruled empires but couldn't escape the ultimate equalizer, a truly mortifying death. We're diving into 30 of the most cringeworthy royal deaths in history, starting with something that happened to all of us multiple times a day. But for these monarchs, it became their final act. Before we settle in for this incredible journey together, I'd love it if you could hit that subscribe button and give this video a like, but only if you're genuinely enjoying what we're exploring tonight. I'm curious, too, where are you watching this from? Are you cozy in bed? Maybe with the lights dimmed low? Drop a comment and let me know. I always love hearing from fellow history lovers. Turn on that ceiling fan or find some gentle background noise. It makes these stories feel even more immersive. Let's dim those lights and dive into tonight's first tale. There's something almost poetic about the fact that the most private moments in our lives can become the most public parts of our legacy. And nowhere is this more true than in the case of King Edmund II, known to history as Edmund Ironside. Edmund wasn't just any king, a survivor, a man who'd spent months fighting the Danish invasions of England in 1016. This guy had stared down Viking longships, survived brutal battles, and earned his nickname Ironside through sheer toughness and determination. But here's where the story takes a turn that would make any of us squirm. It was November 30th, 1016. Edmund had just signed a peace treaty with Canute the Great, dividing England between them. He finally had a moment to breathe, to attend to the basic needs that even kings can't ignore. So he did what anyone would do. He went to use the royal privy. And that's when history took one of its most shocking turns. Medieval toilets weren't exactly what we'd call private. The royal privy was essentially a wooden seat position over a deep pit, often connected to a moat or a river below. And here's the terrifying part. Someone was waiting down there, hidden in the filth and darkness beneath the castle. An assassin had been lying in wait, armed with a spear or a long dagger. Imagine Edmund's final moments. Probably thinking about the kingdom he just secured, maybe planning his next moves as ruler, when suddenly, excruciating pain, the weapon thrust upward, causing injury so severe that Edmund died almost immediately. The man who'd survived countless battles, who'd earned the respect of Vikings, who was literally called Ironside, defeated not by sword or axe, but while answering nature's call. But here's what makes this even more fascinating and disturbing. This wasn't a random attack. Historical accounts suggest this was carefully planned, possibly by supporters of Canute who wanted to eliminate the competition for the English throne. Think about the dedication, the absolute commitment to this plan. Someone had to scout the castle, figure out the layout of the sewage system. Let's just say they had to endure conditions that would make a modern sewage worker quit on the spot. And Edmund wasn't alone in this ignominious fate. Wenceslas III of Bohemia met a similar end, though his story has a slightly different twist that somehow makes it even more tragic. Wenceslas was young, just 18 years old when he became king, and he was trying to restore stability to a kingdom torn apart by civil war. He was known for his intelligence, his attempts at and his genuine care for his people. 1306, Wenceslas was staying at Olomouc's castle. Like many young men, he probably thought he was invincible. He'd survived political intrigue, family betrayals, and a constant threat of assassination that came with medieval royalty. He made a fatal mistake. He went to the privy alone. The details of what happened next vary depending on which historical account you read, but they all agree on one thing. Wenceslas was murdered while using the toilet. Some say it was a single assassin who'd been hiding in the castle. Others suggest it was a coordinated attack by nobles who wanted him dead. But the result was the same. A young king with so much potential dead in the most undignified way possible. What strikes me most about these stories isn't just the shock value, though that's certainly there. It's a reminder that power, no matter how absolute it seems, can't protect you from the most basic human vulnerabilities. These men commanded armies, lived in fortified castles, had food tasters and bodyguards, but they couldn't escape the fact that even kings need to use the bathroom. And there's something almost democratic about that. In those final moments, Edmund Ironside and Wenceslas III weren't mighty rulers. They were just human beings in an incredibly vulnerable position. But here's where it gets even more interesting. These deaths weren't just personal tragedies. They changed the course of history. Edmund's death meant that Canute became sole ruler of England, fundamentally altering the trajectory of British history. Wenceslaus's assassination ended the Przemysl dynasty in Bohemia, leading to a decade of instability and foreign rule. Think about that for a moment. The fate of entire nations, the lives of millions of people shifted because of what happened in a medieval bathroom. It's a reminder that history often hinges on the most unexpected moments, the times when they're most vulnerable. The irony wasn't lost on people even then. Medieval chroniclers, who usually wrote about kings in the most glorious terms possible, struggled with how to record these deaths. How do you maintain royal dignity while describing such an undignified end? Some tried to gloss over the details. Others saw it as divine justice, a reminder that earthly power means nothing to God. And you know what? These stories survive not because they're pleasant, but because they're profoundly human. They remind us that underneath all the crowns and ceremonies, the royal proclamations and golden thrones, these were people dealing with the same basic needs we all have. So the next time you're feeling anxious about an embarrassing moment in your own life, remember Edmund Ironside and Wenceslaus III. If they can be remembered for over 1,000 years and still maintain their place in history, maybe that little thing you're worried about isn't so bad after all. But these bathroom-related royal deaths were just the beginning of the embarrassment. Because if you think dying on the toilet is awkward, wait until you hear about the kings and queens who met their end during what should have been the happiest moments of their lives, their own celebrations and parties. These stories will make you think twice about your next birthday bash. Speaking of celebrations turning deadly, there's something deeply unsettling about the idea that your happiest moments could become your last. You plan the perfect party, invite your closest friends, maybe even find love, and then everything goes horribly, tragically wrong. It's almost like fate has a twisted sense of humor, doesn't it? Take King Alexander I of Greece, for instance. Now, this is a story that sounds so bizarre, so utterly random that if it were in a movie, you'd probably roll your eyes and say, that would never happen in real life. But here's the thing about history. It's often stranger than any fiction we could imagine. It was October 2nd, 1920, and Alexander was living what many would consider a charmed life. He was young, handsome, recently married to a woman he truly loved despite massive political opposition, and he was king of a nation that was experiencing something of a renaissance. Greece was expanding its territory, the economy was growing, and Alexander, though only 27 years old, was proving himself to be a capable leader. But Alexander had a passion that many royals shared. He loved animals. The royal gardens at Tatwa Palace were like a private zoo filled with exotic creatures from around the world. And on this particular afternoon, Alexander decided to take a walk through his beloved gardens with his dog Fritz. It was supposed to be a peaceful moment, a brief escape from the pressures of ruling a kingdom. Here's where the story takes a turn that would make anyone think twice about visiting a zoo. As Alexander strolled through the gardens, Fritz suddenly bolted toward a small enclosure. Inside were two Barbary macaques, basically large, powerful monkeys that had been gifts from various dignitaries. Fritz, being a dog, probably thought these were just unusual-looking creatures to play with, so he charged right into their space. Alexander, being a responsible pet owner, rushed to rescue his dog. But as he reached into the enclosure to pull Fritz away from the agitated monkeys, one of the macaques, later identified as a male named Petros, bit him. This was a serious bite that punctured the skin on Alexander's leg and hand. If this happened today, Alexander would probably get some antibiotics, maybe a tetanus shot, and be back to royal duties within a week. But this was 1920, and our understanding of infection control, let's just say it wasn't what it is now. The bite became infected almost immediately. Alexander was running a high fever. The infection spread through his bloodstream, and despite the efforts of the best doctors in Greece and specialists rushed in from across Europe, Alexander died on October 25th, just 3 weeks after that fateful walk in the garden. But here's what makes this story even more tragic and historically significant. Alexander's death didn't just end a life. It changed the entire trajectory of Greek history. Returned to the throne, and within months Greece was embroiled in a disastrous military campaign in Turkey that led to what historians call the Asia Minor catastrophe. Hundreds of thousands of Greeks died or were displaced, and the country's political landscape was permanently altered, all because a young king tried to save his dog from some monkeys. The irony wasn't lost on people at the time. One German diplomat famously quipped that it was the most extraordinary case in history where the bite of a monkey changed the fate of a nation. But if you think a monkey bite is a strange way for a celebration to turn deadly, wait until you hear about Attila the Hun. Attila is one of those historical figures who seems almost mythical. This was a man who struck fear into the hearts of entire civilizations, who was called the scourge of God by his enemies, who commanded an empire that stretched from the steppes of Central Asia to the gates of Rome itself. Roman emperors paid him tribute just to keep him from destroying their cities. So when Attila decided to get married in 453 AD, you can imagine it was quite the... His bride was a young Gothic woman named Ildiko, and while some sources suggest she may have been taken against her will, others indicate this was a political alliance that Attila was genuinely excited about. Either way, the wedding feast was apparently legendary, even by Hun standards. Hundreds of warriors gathered in Attila's great hall, drinking vast quantities of wine and mead, feasting on roasted meats, celebrating their leader's new marriage. Attila himself is described as being in unusually high spirits, laughing, drinking, and boasting about his conquests. For a man who was usually stern and calculating, this was a rare moment of pure joy. Attila and his new bride retired to their wedding chamber. That's where things get really strange. The next morning, when Attila failed to appear at his usual time, his servants became concerned. Hun kings didn't sleep in. They were typically up before dawn, ready to lead, to conquer, to terrify their enemies. When they finally broke down the door to the wedding chamber, they found a scene that no one expected. The man who had brought the Roman Empire to its knees. And Ildiko, she was sitting beside the bed, unharmed, but clearly traumatized. A severe nosebleed. How does someone die from a nosebleed? But here's what likely happened. Attila had probably been drinking heavily during the celebration, and combined with the excitement and physical exertion of the wedding night, his blood pressure spiked dramatically. When the nosebleed started, he was likely lying flat on his back, causing him to essentially drown in his own blood. Medical experts today believe Attila probably suffered from what's called esophageal varices, enlarged veins in the throat that can rupture suddenly, especially under stress or after heavy drinking. It affects people who drink excessively over long periods. And given what we know about Hun drinking culture, well, but here's where the story gets even more fascinating and suspicious. Some historians suggest that Ildiko might not have been as innocent as she appeared. A young woman, possibly forced into marriage with a brutal warlord, suddenly finds herself alone with him on their wedding night. Was it really just a medical emergency? Or was there something more deliberate at play? But what we do know is that Attila's death threw the Hunnic Empire into immediate chaos. Without their legendary leader, the various tribes that made up a confederation began fighting each other for control. Within a generation, the mighty Hunnic Empire had completely collapsed, never to rise again. It's almost poetic justice, isn't it? The man who had spent his life bringing chaos and destruction to others met his end in what should have been his most peaceful, intimate moment. And here's what really gets me about both of these stories. They remind us that life has this incredible ability to humble us right when we think we're at our highest point. He was just saving his dog. Attila thought he was beginning a new chapter of his life. Neither could have imagined that these moments of joy and normalcy would be their last. It makes you wonder about the celebrations in your own life. That birthday party where everything went perfectly. That wedding where nothing could go wrong. That promotion celebration that felt like the start of something amazing. We never really know which moments will be our most. Which seemingly ordinary decisions will change everything. But as humbling as these party-related deaths were, they pale in comparison to what we're about to explore next. Because sometimes it wasn't the celebration that killed these monarchs. It was something even more intimate, something they wore every single day. Royal fashion, it turns out, could be just as deadly as any assassin. When we think about fashion today, the worst thing that might happen is an embarrassing outfit choice that ends up on social media. But for royalty throughout history, fashion wasn't just about looking good. It was literally a matter of life and death. And I'm not talking about the social death of wearing the wrong colored coat. I'm talking about clothes that could actually kill you. Let me paint you a picture of just how deadly royal fashion could be. It was February 1477, and Charles the Bold was preparing for what would become the Battle of Nancy. Charles wasn't technically a king, but he ruled one of the wealthiest and most powerful duchies in Europe, a man whose fashion choices influenced courts from London to Constantinople. He was known for his incredible extravagance, wearing clothes that cost more than most people would see in a lifetime. On this particular day, Charles was dressed in the height of medieval luxury. His armor was adorned with precious metals. His cloak was lined with ermine, and he wore multiple layers of the finest silks and velvets underneath. But here's the thing about medieval fashion. It wasn't exactly practical, especially not for battle. Charles became separated from his main force. His horse was killed beneath him, and he found himself on foot trying to escape through a frozen marsh. And this is where his fashion choices became fatal. The multiple layers of heavy, waterlogged clothing made it nearly impossible for him to move quickly. The ornate armor designed more for show than protection weighed him down. When enemy soldiers found Charles 3 days later, he was frozen solid in the marsh, still wearing his magnificent clothes that had become his burial shroud. His body was so disfigured by the cold and partially eaten by wolves that he was only identified by his personal valet, who recognized the expensive garments. But that's just the beginning of fashion's deadly legacy in royal circles. The real fashion victim that haunts my dreams is Empress Elizabeth of Austria, known to her friends as Sisi. Elizabeth was considered one of the most beautiful women in 19th century Europe. She was obsessed with maintaining her figure and her image, and she took fashion to extremes that would make modern influencers look positively casual. Elizabeth's daily routine was like something out of a horror movie disguised as a beauty regimen. She would be laced into a corset so tight that her waist measured just 19.5 inches. And this was a woman who was 5 feet 8 inches tall. To put that in perspective, that's smaller than most people's neck circumference. She would fast for days to maintain this impossible silhouette, and she spent hours each day having her floor-length hair braided and arranged. But the corset was a real killer. 1898, Elizabeth was walking along the promenade in Geneva, Switzerland, wearing one of her signature extremely tight corsets beneath a black dress. She was traveling incognito, trying to escape the pressures of court life for a few days. As she approached her steamship, a 25-year-old Italian anarchist named Luigi Licini approached her. Here's where the story takes a turn that perfectly illustrates how fashion can turn a survivable situation into a fatal one. Licini struck Elizabeth with what appeared to be a very thin, narrow file, essentially a needle-like weapon. Under normal circumstances, this might have been a painful but non-fatal wound. Elizabeth's corset was laced so tightly that when the thin blade penetrated between her ribs, she literally couldn't feel it. The pressure from the corset masked the pain and prevented her from realizing how serious the injury was. Thanked the people who helped her and continued walking toward her ship. It wasn't until she was on board and finally tried to loosen her corset that she collapsed. The thin blade had pierced her heart, but the tight corset had been acting like a pressure bandage, keeping her upright and preventing her from bleeding externally. Once the pressure was released, she bled to death within minutes. The ship's doctor later said that if Elizabeth had been wearing normal clothing, she would have immediately felt the wound and likely survived. But her obsession with maintaining that impossibly tiny waist had essentially turned her into a walking time bomb. And here's what makes this even more tragic. Elizabeth was known for her intelligence, her poetry, her progressive political views. She spoke multiple languages fluently, was deeply involved in Hungarian politics, and was considered one of the most cultured women of her time. But she's remembered today largely for her beauty and her obsession with fashion. The very thing that made her famous ultimately killed her. The parallels to our modern world are almost eerie, aren't they? We live in an age where people undergo dangerous surgeries for the perfect Instagram photo, where influencers promote diet teas that can cause serious health problems, where the pressure to look perfect can drive people to extremes that would make Elizabeth's 19.5-inch waist look reasonable. But fashion wasn't always about tight corsets and heavy armor. Sometimes it was even more directly deadly. Wealthy Europeans had developed a fashion for clothing that was literally toxic. The bright colors that were so prized, those brilliant greens, vivid reds, and stunning blues, were often achieved using poisonous substances. Emerald green dresses contained arsenic compounds. Red fabrics were dyed with mercury. Don't even get me started on the makeup. Queen Elizabeth I, for instance, painted her face with a mixture of white lead and vinegar to achieve that porcelain complexion that was considered the height of beauty. Over the years, this lead-based makeup slowly poisoned her, causing hair loss, tooth decay, and probably contributing to her famous fits of rage. She literally wore poison on her face every day for decades. And then there were the wigs. Oh, the wigs. In 18th century Europe, elaborate powdered wigs became all the rage. But these weren't just hair pieces. They were often infested with lice, fleas, and worse. The powder used to whiten them contained lead and other toxic substances. People would keep the same wig for months without proper cleaning, creating what were essentially toxic waste dumps on their heads. Marie Antoinette's famous hairstyles, some of which stood over 3 feet tall, were so elaborate that she couldn't fit through doorways or sleep lying down. But more dangerously, They were held together with a mixture of animal fat, flour, and various chemical compounds that would literally rot on her head, attracting vermin and causing serious skin infections. The fashion for beauty patches, those little black dots that aristocrats would stick on their faces, wasn't just decorative either. They were often used to cover up syphilis sores, meaning that fashionable people were literally advertising their diseases while trying to look beautiful. It's fascinating how fashion has always walked this fine line between beauty and danger, isn't it? We mock historical fashion choices while simultaneously bleaching our hair with chemicals that would horrify a medieval alchemist or injecting our faces with substances that paralyze our muscles. But perhaps the most sobering lesson from these fashion victims is this. The very things we think make us powerful, beautiful, or impressive can become the instruments of our downfall. Elizabeth's corset was supposed to make her more attractive, but it prevented her from recognizing a fatal wound. Charles's magnificent armor was supposed to protect him, but it dragged him down into a frozen marsh. There's something almost poetic about the fact that our attempt to transcend our natural human limitations, to be more beautiful, more impressive, more powerful than nature intended, often end up highlighting just how fragile and human we really are. Next time you're struggling with a tight pair of jeans or uncomfortable heels, remember Elizabeth and Charles. At least your fashion choices probably won't kill you. But speaking of things that can kill you, fashion wasn't the only royal obsession that proved fatal. Sometimes the very abundance that came with power, the ability to have anything you wanted whenever you wanted it, became its own form of deadly trap. Because when you can eat literally anything your heart desires, sometimes your heart desires too much. Death by gluttony. There's something almost tragically human about the fact that unlimited access to anything you want to become your greatest weakness. Most of us spend our lives dreaming about having endless resources, never having to worry about money or availability. But for royalty throughout history, that dream sometimes became a nightmare, especially when it came to food. Let me tell you about King Henry I of England, a man who conquered Normandy, expanded his kingdom, and ruled for over 3 decades, but couldn't conquer his own appetite. Henry was known as Henry Beauclerk because he was one of the few kings of his era who could actually read and write. This was a man of intelligent strategy and remarkable political skill. He had successfully navigated the treacherous waters of medieval politics, survived multiple assassination attempts, and built one of the most stable kingdoms in 12th century Europe. But Henry had one weakness that would ultimately prove fatal: his absolute obsession with lampreys. If you're not familiar with lampreys, let me paint you a picture that might make you lose your appetite. Imagine a creature that looks like a cross between an eel and something from your worst nightmare. They're basically jawless fish with circular suction cup mouths filled with rows of razor-sharp teeth. They attach themselves to other fish and suck their blood like aquatic vampires. And Henry I, he thought they were absolutely delicious. Medieval lampreys were considered the ultimate delicacy, prepared in rich spice sauces, and served only at the most exclusive tables. They were expensive, difficult to prepare properly, and had a flavor that was apparently, well, isn't too strong a word. Henry would often demand them to be served multiple times a week, despite repeated warnings from his physicians. Medieval doctors, primitive as their knowledge was, had figured out that lampreys were incredibly difficult to digest. They're incredibly rich, high in oils and fats that the human digestive system struggles to process, especially in large quantities. Henry's personal physician, a man who'd studied at the medical schools in Salerno, repeatedly warned the king that his lamprey consumption was dangerous. But here's the thing about absolute power. It makes you feel absolutely invincible, even against your own body's limitations. In November of 1135, Henry was staying at his hunting lodge in Normandy when he received a fresh shipment of lampreys that had been specially prepared by his favorite cook. Well, earlier that day, he'd been complaining of stomach pains for weeks. Henry couldn't resist. According to chronicler Henry of Huntingdon, 8 of the lampreys, though they always disagreed with him, against the advice of the physician. What happened next was described by witnesses as both swift and agonizing. Within hours of the meal, Henry was doubled over in excruciating pain. His stomach, unable to process the rich, oily fish on top of what was likely an already compromised digestive system, essentially shut down. Medieval accounts describe symptoms that modern doctors would recognize as severe food poisoning combined with what was probably a perforated bowel. Henry lingered for a week, growing weaker each day, before finally dying on December 1st, 1135. The man who had survived battles, political intrigue, and family betrayals was ultimately defeated by his favorite meal, But here's what makes this story even more tragic. Henry's death plunged England into nearly 20 years of civil war known. His only legitimate male heir had died in a shipwreck years earlier, leaving his daughter Matilda to fight his nephew Stephen for the crown. Thousands died in the resulting conflict, all because a king couldn't resist one more plate of lampreys. And Henry wasn't alone in letting his appetite get the better of him. Meet King Adolf Fredrik of Sweden, a man whose death makes Henry's lamprey incident look almost reasonable by comparison. Adolf Fredrik was known as the king who ate himself to death. That's not hyperbole. It was February 12, 1771, and Adolf Fredrik was attending a particularly lavish dinner party. Swedish royal feasts in the 18th century were legendary affairs, tables groaning under the weight of dozens of courses, exotic foods imported from across Europe, and wines that cost more per bottle than most people earned in a year. Fredrik wasn't just enjoying the feast. He was trying to consume. Contemporary accounts describe him eating his way through multiple courses with an almost compulsive determination. We're talking about a meal that included multiple meat dishes, several fish courses, elaborate pastries, and desserts that were works of art in themselves. The final course was what did him in, hetväg, a traditional Swedish dessert made with hot milk, cinnamon, and massive amounts of cream and sugar. Didn't just have a serving. He had multiple servings along with what chroniclers describe as an abundance of champagne. The king was in agony, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of rich food and alcohol, began to shut down. But unlike Henry I, who at least had the excuse of eating something genuinely difficult to digest, Adolf Fredrik had essentially eaten himself into a food coma from which he never recovered. He died that same night. And here's the kicker. Sweden barely noticed. Adolf Fredrik had been such an ineffective ruler, so focused on his pleasures rather than governing that his death was almost a relief to his political advisors. His son Gustav III actually turned out to be a much more effective monarch. The Swedish people, with a characteristic dry humor, began referring to Adolf Fredrik as the king who ate himself to death, and the phrase stuck. Even today in Sweden, when someone overindulges at a meal, people might joke that they're pulling an Adolf Fredrik. But what fascinates me about these stories isn't just the absurdity of dying from. It's what they reveal about the psychology of unlimited power. Both Henry and Adolf Fredrik had access to literally anything they wanted. There was no force on earth that could tell them no when they wanted something. And maybe that's exactly the problem. Think about it from a modern perspective. We live in an age where food abundance is a real issue for many people. We have access to more variety, more flavors, more indulgence than any generation in human history. And what do we see? Rising obesity rates, eating disorders, food addictions that could be just as deadly as Henry's lampreys or Adolf Fredrik's dessert obsession. There's actually a psychological term for this, hedonic adaptation. It means that the more we have access to something pleasurable, the more we need to achieve the same level of satisfaction. Henry probably started with just enjoying an occasional lamprey dish, but over time he needed more and more to get that same pleasure. Adolf Fredrik likely began with normal-sized meals, but gradually needed increasingly elaborate feasts to feel satisfied. It's the same reason why lottery winners often end up broke, why celebrities struggle with addiction, why people who seem to have everything often feel empty inside. Unlimited access to pleasure doesn't make us happier. It just moves the goalpost further and further away. But here's what really gets me about these royal gluttons. They had access to the best medical advice of their time, advisors who warned them about the dangers, and they ignored all of it. Henry's physician literally told him that lampreys would kill him. Adolf Fredrik's courtiers had seen him overindulge countless times before, but the immediate pleasure was more powerful than the long-term consequences. How many of us ignore health warnings, dietary advice, or our own body signals because we want what we want right now? The difference is that when we overindulge, we might get a stomach ache or gain a few pounds. When kings overindulge, entire kingdoms could fall into chaos. There's something almost poetic about the fact that these men who commanded armies and controlled vast resources were ultimately defeated by their inability to control themselves. All the power in the world couldn't save them from their own appetites. It makes you wonder what we might be eating, drinking, or consuming right now that future generations will look back on with the same mixture of horror and fascination that we feel when we hear about Henry's lampreys or Adolf Fredrik's fatal feast. But if you think dying from overeating is embarrassing, wait until you hear about the kings and queens who met their end while pursuing activities that were supposed to be fun, healthy, and noble. Because sometimes the very sports and games that were meant to display royal prowess became the stage for their most humiliating defeats. Death by jousting. You'd think that after hearing about kings dying from their own appetites, royal sports would seem like a healthy alternative. Physical exercise, displays of skill and courage. Because when you combine royal ego, medieval safety standards, and activities involving sharp objects moving at high speeds, let's just say the results weren't always pretty. 1559, and all of Paris is buzzing with excitement. The streets are lined with spectators, banners are flying, and the most elaborate tournament in decades is about to begin. This isn't just any sporting event. This is a celebration of not one, but two royal weddings. And King Henry II of France is determined to make it a spectacle that will be remembered for generations. Henry II was by all accounts everything you'd want in a Renaissance king. He was tall, athletic, considered handsome by the standards of his time, and absolutely obsessed with proving his physical prowess. At 40 years old, he was still competing in tournaments against men half his age, and he usually won. This was a man who could handle a lance like a modern athlete handles a tennis racket, who'd been training in the art of mounted combat. The tournament was being held to celebrate his daughter Elizabeth's marriage to King Philip II of Spain and his sister Marguerite's marriage to the Duke of Savoy. The whole thing was designed to showcase French power, wealth, and military might to the assembled European nobility. But here's where the story takes a turn that nobody, and I mean nobody, the final joust of the day was supposed to be a friendly exhibition match. Henry had already defeated several opponents and was feeling invincible. His final challenger was Gabriel Montgomery, the captain of his own Scottish Guard, essentially his bodyguard. Montgomery was 35 years old, an experienced juicer, but also someone who knew better than to seriously hurt his king. The rules were simple. Two riders charged at each other with long wooden lances, trying to knock each other off their horses. The lances were supposed to shatter. That was actually the goal. A clean break meant you'd hit your target squarely. What you definitely didn't want was for the lance to stay intact, because that could cause serious injury. As the two men lined up for their charge, something felt off to the spectators. Some later said they noticed Montgomery's lance looked different, possibly heavier, possibly not properly prepared. Others mentioned that Henry seemed distracted, possibly thinking about the celebration feast that would follow. The impact was thunderous. You could hear it across the entire field. Both lances shattered exactly as they were supposed to. The crowd began to cheer. Henry remained upright in his saddle, apparently unharmed. Montgomery raised his hand in acknowledgement of the good, and then Henry began to sway. What nobody had seen in the dust and chaos of the impact was that a large splinter from Montgomery's shattered lance had found its way through the gap in Henry's visor. This wasn't just any splinter. Contemporary accounts describe it as being about the size of a pencil, and it had penetrated several inches into the king's skull just above his right eye. Henry managed to stay on his horse long enough to ride to the edge of the field, but then he collapsed. The splinter had driven deep into his brain, and in an era before modern neurosurgery, this was essentially a death sentence. The court physicians did everything they could. They consulted with Andreas Vesalius, one of the most famous doctors in Europe, who had rushed to Paris when he heard about the accident. They even conducted what was probably one of the first recorded experimental surgeries, practicing on the heads of executed criminals to try to figure out how to safely remove the splinter. But it was hopeless. Henry lingered for 10 agonizing days, drifting in and out of consciousness, sometimes lucid enough to give orders for the kingdom, sometimes completely delirious. On July 10th, 1559, he finally died, and with him died the stability of the French crown. His death threw France into decades of religious civil war. His successor, Francis II, was only 15 years old and died within a year. The power vacuum that followed Henry's death contributed to some of the bloodiest conflicts in French history, all because of a splinter, a piece that would no bigger than your finger. But here's what makes this story even more tragic and more relevant to our modern world than you might think. Henry II didn't have to be in that tournament. He was the king of France, for crying out loud. He had professional knights who could have represented him. He had already proven his skill earlier in the day. This final joust was purely about ego, about proving that he was still the best, still the strongest, still the most skilled warrior in his kingdom. And that ego killed him. It's like a modern CEO insisting on doing their own stunts in a commercial, or a politician refusing to wear a bulletproof vest because it doesn't look strong enough. The very quality that probably helped Henry become a successful ruler, that refusal to back down, that need to prove himself, became the thing that destroyed him. But Henry's story isn't unique. Royal sporting accidents were surprisingly common, and often even more absurd. Take Prince Arthur of Wales, the older brother of the future Henry VIII. Arthur was supposed to be the future of the Tudor dynasty. Carefully educated, politically astute, and by all accounts, a promising young leader, he married Catherine of Aragon in 1501, cementing an important alliance with Spain. But Arthur had a passion for hunting, which in medieval times wasn't just a hobby. It was considered essential training for warfare and a demonstration of royal masculinity. The problem was that medieval hunting was incredibly dangerous. We're talking about chasing wild boars armed with spears, pursuing deer through dense forests at high speeds, and using weapons that could easily kill a man if mishandled. On April 2nd, 1502, Arthur was leading a hunting party through the Welsh countryside near Ludlow Castle. It was supposed to be a routine expedition, the kind of thing he'd done hundreds of times before. The horses were in good condition, and Arthur was surrounded by experienced huntsmen, but something went wrong. Exactly what happened is still debated by historians, but the most likely scenario is that Arthur's horse was startled by the sudden appearance of a wild boar. Riders often carried long spears, and it appears that Arthur was either impaled by his own weapon or struck by another rider's spear in the confusion. Arthur was carried back to Ludlow Castle, but he died within hours. He was just 15 years old. That's just a tragic accident. But here's where it gets interesting. Arthur's death changed the entire course of English and arguably world history. His younger brother Henry became heir to the throne instead. Well, let's just say he turned out to be a rather different kind of king than Arthur would have been. Arthur was described as scholarly, diplomatic, and devoted to his wife, Catherine. England might never have broken from the Catholic Church, might never have executed 2 queens, might never have become the naval power that would later dominate the world. All because of a hunting accident. But here's what really gets me about these sporting deaths. They reveal something fascinating about the psychology of power. Both Henry II and Arthur were participating in activities that were supposed to demonstrate their fitness to rule. Jousting and hunting weren't just hobbies. They were public displays of the physical courage and skill that people expected from their leaders. In medieval thinking, a king who couldn't handle a horse or wield a weapon was a king who couldn't defend his kingdom. These weren't recreational activities. They were job requirements. But that created a terrible paradox. The very activities that were supposed to prove these men were fit to rule were also the activities most likely to kill them. It's like requiring modern presidents to perform extreme sports to prove their leadership abilities. We still do this, don't we? We expect our leaders to appear strong, fearless, willing to take risks. We criticize politicians who seem too cautious, too careful, too protected. But then we're shocked when that same risk-taking behavior leads to disaster. Think about modern leaders who insist on flying their own planes, driving their own cars, or participating in dangerous photo ops. The same impulse that drove Henry II to joust against his bodyguard drives modern leaders to take unnecessary risks, to appear strong and relatable. The difference is that today, when a leader gets hurt doing something risky, we have better medical care and more stable succession plans. When Henry II died from his jousting accident, it nearly destroyed France. When Arthur died from his hunting accident, it changed the religious landscape of Europe forever. Sports were supposed to be the safe way for royalty to demonstrate their warrior credentials. No foreign armies, no political intrigue, just good, clean competition between friends. But as we've seen, sometimes the most dangerous enemy was the one you never saw coming, your own need to prove yourself. Still, at least these kings died doing something they loved, something that was supposed to keep them healthy and strong. But some royal deaths were even more frustrating than that, because they happened when these monarchs were trying to get better, when they trusted the very people who were supposed to heal them. And let me tell you, medieval medicine could be far more deadly than any jousting accident. If you've ever left a doctor's appointment feeling worse than when you went in, you'll appreciate this next chapter in our Royal Tragedy collection. Because sometimes the people who were supposed to save these monarchs' lives ended up being the very ones who killed them. When you hear about medieval medical practices, you'll never complain about waiting in a modern doctor's office again. Let me tell you about King Charles II of England, a man who survived civil war, exile, plague, and the Great Fire of London, but couldn't survive his own physicians trying to help him. It was February 2nd, 1685, and Charles was doing what he did every morning to the gardens of Whitehall Palace. This was a man who at 54 was still relatively healthy, still sharp-minded, still fully engaged in running one of Europe's most powerful kingdoms, preparing for another day of meetings with Parliament, correspondence with foreign courts, and the endless political maneuvering that came with being king. But as he was shaving that morning, something went wrong. Charles suddenly collapsed, convulsing violently. His attendants rushed to help him, and within minutes, the royal physicians were summoned. These weren't just any doctors. These were the most educated, most experienced medical practitioners in England, men who had trained at the finest universities and served the royal family for years. And they absolutely panicked. What happened next reads like a medical horror story disguised as treatment. The royal physicians, determined to save their king's life, unleashed every single medical technique they knew, all at the same time. First, they bled him. And I don't mean a little bloodletting. They drained 16 ounces of blood from his arm, believing this would balance his humors. When that didn't work, they bled him again from the other arm. Then they applied heated cups to his shoulders to draw out more blood through his skin. But they were just getting started. Next, they gave him an emetic. Essentially, they poisoned him with antimony to make him vomit, believing this would purge the illness from his. Then they gave him another emetic, then another purgative. Still not satisfied, they shaved his head and applied blistering agents to his scalp, chemicals that literally burned his skin because they believed this would draw the sickness out through his head. They forced him to sniff hellebore, a plant that's basically a natural irritant to make him sneeze violently. They applied hot irons to the soles of his feet. And through all of this, Charles II, the man who had charmed his way back onto the throne, who had navigated some of the most complex political situations in English history, was conscious and aware of what was happening to him. For 4 days, this torture continued. The physicians, convinced they were saving their king, kept escalating their treatments. They gave him bezoar stones, essentially gallstones from animals that were believed to have magical healing properties. They administered Goa stone, which was literally powdered bezoar mixed with precious metals. They tried extracted human skull, because apparently someone thought that would help. On February 6th, after 4 days of this treatment, Charles finally died. But here's the thing that makes this story so tragic. Modern medical historians who have studied the case believe Charles probably suffered a stroke or heart attack. With proper rest, hydration, and supportive care, he might very well have recovered. His doctors essentially tortured him to death with kindness. The royal physician's diary from that week still exists, and it reads like a checklist of medieval medical disasters. Bled the king twice more, applied Spanish flies to raise blisters, administered Peruvian bark. It's horrifying to read because you can sense how desperately these men wanted to save their king and how every single thing they did made him worse. But Charles's case wasn't unusual for the time. Royal medicine in the 17th century was essentially a deadly combination of arrogance, ignorance, and good intentions. Take Queen Caroline of England, wife of King George II. Caroline was known for her intelligence. She was one of the most politically astute queens in British history, serving essentially as her husband's chief advisor on many matters. She spoke multiple languages, was deeply read in philosophy and science, and was considered one of the most cultured women of her era. But Caroline had a secret that would ultimately kill her, an umbilical hernia that she'd been hiding for years. In modern times, an umbilical hernia is a relatively simple surgical procedure. It's often done as outpatient surgery, and most people recover completely within a few weeks. But in 1737, the idea of a queen allowing doctors to examine her abdomen, let alone perform surgery on it, was absolutely scandalous. Caroline was so embarrassed by her condition, so concerned about maintaining royal dignity, that she refused to let anyone examine her properly. She wore increasingly tight corsets to hide the growing bulge, which only made the problem worse. She self-medicated with various tonics and potions, none of which helped. Caroline suffered in silence. She continued her royal duties, attended state functions, participated in court ceremonies, all while dealing with increasing pain and a growing medical emergency that she was too embarrassed to address properly. Finally, on November 9, 1737, Caroline collapsed during a royal dinner. The hernia had become strangulated. Part of her intestine had become trapped and was dying. Surgery was the only option, but it was far too late. The royal surgeons did their best, but they were operating on a patient whose condition had deteriorated for months, using techniques that were primitive, even by 18th century standards, and without any form of anesthesia or antiseptic procedures. Caroline endured the surgery while fully conscious, biting down on a leather strap to keep from screaming. She lived for 11 more agonizing days before dying on November 20th. Her last words were reportedly to her husband, "At least I have the satisfaction to see that the English love their queen." The tragedy is that if Caroline had sought treatment even 6 months earlier, she probably would have survived. The surgical techniques existed, crude as they were, but the combination of royal pride, medical embarrassment, and the social constraints of her era literally killed her. And here's what's really fascinating about these medical disasters. They reveal how even unlimited wealth and access to the best medical care of the time could be worse than no medical care at all. Charles II had 14 different physicians attending to him, men who had studied at Oxford, Cambridge, and European medical schools. Caroline had access to the finest surgeons in England, but their treatments were based on medical theories that were not just wrong, but actively harmful. Medieval and early modern medicine was built on the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Doctors believed that illness was caused by an imbalance of these humors, and that the way to cure someone was to restore balance through bloodletting, purging, vomiting, and other procedures that basically tortured the patient. The irony is that the poor, who couldn't afford medical care, often had better survival rates than the wealthy. When you couldn't afford a doctor, your body had to heal itself naturally. When you could afford the best medical care available, you got bled, purged, and poisoned until you died. It makes you think about our modern medical system, doesn't it? We have access to treatments that would seem like magic to Charles II physicians. We can replace hearts, cure cancers, and perform surgeries that would have been unimaginable even 50 years ago. But we also live in an era where medical errors are still a leading cause of death, where patients can be overtreated just as dangerously as they can be undertreated, where the pursuit of the latest and most expensive treatment isn't always better than careful, conservative care. Charles II and Caroline died because their doctors were trying too hard to help them. They died because they had access to too much medical intervention. It's a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous thing about being powerful is that people do anything, absolutely anything, to try to save you, even when those very efforts are what's killing you. The next time you're tempted to demand the latest experimental treatment or to doctor shop until you find someone who will give you the aggressive intervention you think you need, remember Charles II. Sometimes the best medicine is the simplest medicine. Sometimes the best doctor is the one who knows when not to intervene. But speaking of interventions that went tragically wrong, our next stories involve a different kind of risk-taking altogether. Because if you think medical malpractice is embarrassing, wait until you hear about the kings and queens who died because they just couldn't resist the call of forbidden love.